You know, if I had to put this guy on the totally 100% infallible and accurate gamer spectrum, I think comparing him to Pavlich would give you tonal whiplash so bad it would break something. A more polar opposite you would be hard-pressed to find. For instance, as part of the research for this video, I read Fighting Liberal, the autobiography of today's man of the hour, and one quote in particular stood out to me that I think captures the essence of this guy pretty well. It is, or it should be, the simple things in life that contribute most to culture and civilization. Men have been establishing homes, building factories, harnessing streams, bridging canyons, conquering the earth and the skies. And yet rich are the people in this world to whom trees and water and growing things bring hope and happiness. This, I believe, characterizes George Norris very well, as you will soon see. Back in the day when being a progressive actually fucking meant something, Norris championed the movement as the guy from Nebraska who just wanted everyone to have a good time. Our story does not begin in Nebraska, however. This man actually originates from fucking Ohio, of all places. George William Norris was born on July 11th, 1861 in York Township of northeastern Ohio. He was the 11th child and second son of not particularly well-off farmers, and most of his early days were spent on the farm. It was a simpler time back then, if you ignore the ongoing Civil War, but Norris's formative years were spent in the relative peace of rural farm life. His father would die when he was only 3 years old, which very early required him to work extremely hard to keep his family afloat. With his older brother having been killed in Georgia earlier that year, Norris grew up very fast. He learned how to endure hardships and live simply, a philosophy that considerably influenced his future career in politics. Living poor will do things to a person. And when I say he was poor, I'm using his words, like he was dirt fucking poor. But as Norris would learn, it's not the hand you're dealt, it's how you play it. He would still attend school despite his situation and was a pretty solid student. He joined the debate society early on, ushering in his interest and discussion in politics very early in his life. His farm work in the summers had also resulted in him being built like a brick shithouse, so despite finishing what education he could take in rural fucking Ohio by the age of 14, he was basically an adult by that point. Around this time, he would become interested in both law and politics, following in the footsteps of his parents and his state in general, and immediately jumping on the Republican bandwagon. The nomination and election of Rutherford Hayes, also an Ohio native, naturally caused him to be swept up in the excitement, and only further hinted at where his career was going to go from here. So Republican was he, in his teenage years, that he straight up rejected a job offer from a prominent lawyer because he was a Democrat. He would take teaching positions on the side to make a little money starting at the age of 16, later attending Baldwin University with two of his older sisters the next year. Afterwards, he would attend Valparaiso University, where he would study law, earning his degree in 1883. It was an interesting school. Most of its attendants were less well-off folks, with tuition being $18 fucking dollars. Holy shit. He continued his journey into politics here as well, again joining debate clubs and LARPing with parliamentary procedure in the process. The times they were a-changin' though, and following his graduation he found himself on a train to Washington Territory in search of a fresh start. He wanted to start up a law practice or maybe teach over there, but as it turns out, Washington is a shithole, so he didn't stay long. His family had owned a bit of land out in Nebraska, so he hopped back on the train and headed there. But remember, no money, so he went back to Ohio to teach for a bit before moving to Nebraska permanently. He sold the land to move to Beaver City, where he would start up his law practice in earnest. He seemed to really like the state since, you know, farm boy. He was not here to farm though, and gradually his business would pick up. During this time, he remained devoutly Republican, even though he himself admits that this was because he was young and dumb and just excited to be included in something. Eventually, he would earn a seat on the district bench of his county, in his first real experience with political shenanigans. He would spend 7 years in that position and would use his skills and his morals to fight for what he thought was right, notably during a time of crop failure by keeping farmers from losing their homes. He didn't neglect himself though. In 1890, he would get cuffed, having 3 daughters and a son during their time in the sun. However, the boy would be stillborn after an accident. His wife would also unfortunately pass during the birth of their 3rd child in 1901. He fell into a bit of a depressive spiral and would almost die, but the masculine urge to protect and care for his family snapped him out of it. He married again in 1903, and she would be his companion for the rest of his life. Okay, that's the only depressing shit, I promise. In 1900, he had moved with his family to McCook, where he almost immediately fell into the politics trap. He originally didn't want to involve himself in things, but as people kept bitching at him to run for a seat in the House of Representatives, he eventually said fine. He ran Republican, obviously, pay fucking attention, in 1902, where he would unseat the incumbent by a whopping 181 votes. The race included one part where Norris challenged his opponent to a literal corn husking contest, which resonated with the largely farmer voter base, who, in general, saw him as a good guy who would understand them. Fuck, imagine if elections were decided like that. Maybe it wouldn't be so soul-crushing to watch. Anyways, like I said, he fucking won. Upon his ascension, he almost immediately slid into the progressive wing of the party, partially inspired by Teddy-based Roosevelt in the altering of his convictions. However, the main reason was the party itself. You see, politicians are assholes. Norris's partisanship died pretty quickly when he realized that Republicans were just as big of assholes as the Democrats were. Norris was also what you may call a free-spirited individual, and he didn't give much of a fuck about party discipline. He fought for what he thought was right, and this pissed the party off. He served in the House until 1913, during which he got his crash course in the shit show of federal politics. It largely began with a single bill regarding tariffs called the Payne-Aldrich Bill. The Republican Party bosses wanted their monopolistic interests protected, so the Speaker of the House, Joseph G. Cannon, appointed a committee and essentially rigged the vote to include a huge petroleum tariff in the bill. Basically, 7 people decided to fuck over the country. There wasn't much he could do about this one, but it would give him the justification to fuck over the Speaker of the House. Remember political machines? Turns out it's machines all the way to the top. And due to some loopholes, technicalities, and party control, the Speaker of the House had essentially dictatorial powers. Joe Cannon, the Speaker around now, was also a jackass who was tripping balls on power. Over the course of 1910, Norris would lead the effort to overthrow him. He put forward a motion that essentially made it so House committees had to be elected and that the Speaker could not be on any committee. He had made some changes to get the Democrats on his side, and when push came to shove, the motion passed and the power of the Speaker was broken. He and Cannon would go on to have a pretty okay relationship after Norris was elected to Senate, which honestly shows that Norris was a pretty stand-up dude. He served in the Judiciary Committee in the House for a while, and he got to have a federal judge impeached for being a dickhead, but since his time in the House was wrapping up, he had bigger fish to fry. His term ended with him complaining that political parties are cringe because they are, and that parties are corrupt, which they are. He even wrote a couple letters to President Taft in 1910 bitching about it, to which he responded by clarifying that political favors couldn't influence legislation. Yeah, that one didn't stick. His final House term would end in 1912, with him deciding instead to run for U.S. Senate. As we have established already, he was progressive and popular. He would win by a pretty large margin, beginning his long career as a senator from Nebraska. The rest of the stuffy asshats in the Senate did not like him from the get-go. As it turns out, telling party discipline to go fuck itself makes you unpopular with party aristocrats. He would pretty quickly end up on the Agricultural Committee because, you know, Cornhusker. Things sailed pretty smoothly until eventually World War I happens, where he vehemently opposed American entry into it. Stupid European conflict that the US had no reason to involve itself in. He participated in a filibuster by the anti-war crowd, which included the likes of Bob La Follette, that lasted 4 fucking days in March of 1917 to shut down a bill aimed at arming merchant ships. But as you may know, his efforts were futile, and the US would enter the war the following month. This really pissed off a lot of people because, you know, war hawks be war hawks, but ultimately nothing bad came of it, and he kept winning his re-election, so it was all good. His anti-war sentiment did make him a target of his own government, however. You know, paranoid assholes be paranoid assholes, so it was somewhat expected. He got spied on, and his family was harassed, and it was a whole thing. Regardless, the 1918 Senate election saw him fucking smoke the guy he was running against, so regardless of war racket tomfuckery, he was here to stay. Immediately following the end of the war, he supported the idea of the League of Nations, and had wanted something similar for over a decade by this point, but this also went nowhere because isolationists be isolationists, and the League of Nations proposed by the Versailles Treaty was fucking stupid. There's also a couple of pages where he gets a little based, where he tirades about Japan being untrustworthy cunts, and also goes off about how Germany should have been beaten into the ground and rendered incapable of fielding a military, but that's neither here nor there. The years following the big one were busy. First up was Harding. There were some shenanigans involving rich assholes running for Senate off the backs of their money, which, I mean, good to see that nothing has changed, but other than that, the Harding administration wasn't too bad. Mostly because he fucking died before he could screw an excessive amount of shit up. The reign of Calvin Coolidge would follow, where Norris was actually involved in a lot of stuff. Mainly, there was the Teapot Dome scandal, which is just such a clusterfuck that I couldn't not talk about it. The long and short is that there was a lot of bribery going on involving a lot of oil money, fraud, and multiple members of Congress. From 1922 to 1929, there was an extensive investigation which led to the first case of a U.S. congressman being sent to prison. This little shit show also resulted in Congress getting the power to subpoena any U.S. citizen for their tax records regardless of status, an idea that you know damn well that Norris fully supported. In the meantime, he continued his streak of not giving a fuck by openly backing a Democrat in Pennsylvania to destroy a Republican political machine there in 1926. The machinist would still win, however, when he entered the Senate, Norris immediately had him investigated for corruption and voter fraud, which he would be found guilty of and kicked to the curb in 1929. By this point, the establishment was fucking sick of him. This was only exacerbated by the fact that, in 1928, he would openly back Democrat candidate Alfred Smith for president over Herbert Hoover. He knew Hoover was a moron, and he decided to think for himself rather than follow the party line. The horror. This did have a unique side effect back home in Nebraska. Despite the fact that he was still a Republican, he got a not insignificant number of votes from more progressive Democrats in the state. Neat. The Republican machine in the state was done, though. They wanted him gone, regardless of whether he was the only guy with a spine who could actually win shit or not. So for 1930 elections, they devised a scheme. They found a grocery store clerk who also happened to be named George Norris and forced him onto the primary ticket. The idea was that the confusion would force any votes for either Norris to be invalidated, essentially taking him out of the race. This was, naturally, a bit fucky, especially considering that his application fee had not only arrived to the Senate late, but was also paid for by Norris's biggest competitor. There was a trial and other shenanigans which revealed that this guy was doing a bunch of other corrupt shit, so he and the fake Norris both went to jail, and the real Norris won the most decisive election of his career. The most important, series of events to come out of these years was the battle over the Tennessee Valley Authority. Turns out, the Mississippi and its tributaries have a tendency to wreck shit, so conservation was on many people's minds. Norris believed that the fix would be building dams and reservoirs, killing a shitload of birds with one gigantic slab of concrete. You see, dams are great. Norris wanted to dam the entire Tennessee River Valley. Certainly a bold plan. Problem is that he wanted to do this without a profit incentive. He just wanted the people to be able to have access to cheap electricity and not have all of their shit destroyed by floods every year? Fucking wacko. Anyways, the ordeal began in 1921 when the unfinished Wilson Dam in the Muscle Shoals ran into issues. 3 classical Republican presidents in a row meant that the prevailing attitude of the time was a whole lot of let business decide. So to fix the issue with Muscle Shoals, Henry Ford put in a bid. Bad. Congress accepted this, but bills put forward to turn the dam over to Ford kinda went nowhere, fiercely opposed by Norris, which ended in Ford withdrawing his offer. Norris got a lot of death threats for this one by every poor sucker who was dumb enough to fall for an investment opportunity in the land that Ford no longer had interest in, but he didn't care all that much. Bigger fish to fry. Norris got in shit for wanting the power of the TVA to be government-controlled. Bills he introduced in 1926, 27, 29, and 31 regarding the dams went nowhere because fuck you. The Power Trust was also bitching because they didn't like their monopoly being challenged. Wouldn't be until a regime change came that shit would get done. Norris supported FDR and the New Deal heavily, and one such part of this New Deal was the TVA, which would finally pass Congress and not get vetoed in 1933, establishing a government corporation to control the dams and their output. And all told, the TVA had absolutely accomplished its purpose. By the time all of the dams had been constructed, river navigability had improved massively, effects of floods and erosion had been reduced, and both power output and consumption had increased in the area, allowing for a great deal of development. The project also set a global standard for how effective damming rivers could be, and naturally was incredibly useful when the Second World War rolled around. The first hydroelectric dam constructed by the TVA would end up bearing the name of its most ardent supporter, and Norris Dam still stands today, and is on the National Register of Historic Places. He would continue his progressive streak during this time, in 1932 cooperating with Fiorello LaGuardia to abolish yellow dog contracts. He would also participate in the establishment of the Rural Electrification Administration and would fight poll taxes because they are fucking stupid. Notably though, in 1933 he would achieve his most important political, there's the asterisk, victory. Norris would be the driving force behind the 20th Amendment to the United States Constitution. All this did was move the inauguration date of new senators and presidents to January instead of March. In practice, this was fucking huge, since the 4 agonizing months between November 6th and March 4th was a time of great dumb fuckery. They were referred to as lame duck sessions because literally nothing would get done. Norris had proposed it as early as 1922, but because of Congress dragging their feet, nothing would happen until 1933. Now, granted, his solution to the problem was to be unfathomably based and abolish the Electoral College, but since that would put a lot of fat cat politicians out of work, that went nowhere. The long and short is that his bills kept getting defeated through inaction, and he had to wait until Congress went to the Democrats to get the bill through. On January 23rd of 1933, the amendment would be passed by a large majority, serving as what I believe was the high watermark of Norris's career. Norris always fought with the people in mind. He believed that the common man was the backbone of the nation, and their government should reflect that. He wanted efficiency and transparency, and damn if he didn't try to achieve the former. Back in Nebraska, he became the driving force behind the adoption of a unicameral legislature, essentially just taking the 2 houses and merging them together. This was a adopted in 1935, and it worked like a charm, cutting the tax costs of maintaining the government literally in half. To this day, Nebraska is the only state to have done this. When 1936 rolled around, Norris left the Republican Party formally. He would run for his Senate seat regardless as an independent, and would actually succeed for one final term. He had come to the realization that the Blues and the Reds weren't so different. They all took their bribes, lobbying, from the same place anyway. The Second World War would roll around pretty soon after, and this time Norris went full intervention. The US getting directly attacked was a different story, and the Nazis were being Nazis, so he voted in favor of both Lend-Lease and the declaration of war on Japan. He took the angle of one final war, and wanted this one to end with Germany and Japan being buried and all weapons of war destroyed. This didn't happen, as you may have seen, but he was no longer in a position to influence this as his term expired in 1942, following which he would lose his re-election after 40 years in Congress. Naturally, being an old-ass man by this point, he simply went home. In his eyes, he had done all he could, and he was content with what he had accomplished. 2 years later, on September 2nd of 1944, at the age of 83, he would pass away. His legacy long outlived him in multiple ways, notably through that big ol' constitutional amendment. He was included in JFK's Profiles of Courage, and FDR referred to him as the gentle knight of progressive ideals. Overall, there isn't really anything funny about him. He was just a decent person of decent stock trying to make America a better place in any way that he could. He didn't need extreme populism and partisanship to make that happen. There are a few politicians in history that one can say that about, and I can definitely say that over the last, 2 months that this video has consumed in total, I have gained a deep respect for the man. I think he represents people at their best, a person who simply wants to do good and live life. And honestly, what more can you ask for? That about does it for this video. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you around.